Just a moment. Just lost my screen.
We had to have it happen at least once.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Well, maybe. Yes. Okay.
I can also, oh, sorry.
What were you going to say?
I was just going to say I can share slides on your behalf too, and if you're having any trouble.
Yeah, maybe that will be easier. It's not working the way I expected here.
Sure. Let me just pull them up.
Okay.
Does that look okay?
Yes, there we go. Thanks. So as Emily mentioned, I am Ann Griffith, and I am with Enterprise Community Partners. I am Senior Director of our economic mobility work, and I am very excited to participate in this conversation. For today, I'm going to share a little bit about our approach to thinking about racial equity through partnerships and that measurement. But I'm really thinking about this as being a conversation, given the ways that our institutions and systems are designed to replicate disparities in outcomes. I think we really consider this work as being an uphill battle. And so we're all contributing to it as best we can. Move to the next slide. Just quickly, a little bit about Enterprise. Enterprise Community Partners is a national nonprofit with a mission to make home and community places of pride, power, and belonging, and platforms for resilience and upward mobility for all. We accomplish this mission in several different ways by developing and deploying programs and supporting community organizations on the ground, advocating for nonpartisan policy at every level of government, investing capital and building and preserving rental homes. And then we own and operate 13,000 affordable homes as well. Next slide. Our economic mobility initiative brings together multidisciplinary teams within Enterprise that include data and evaluation as well as policy to explore how housing can serve as a platform to eliminate disparities in economic outcomes through partnerships. And while we are very keyed into the question of economic disparities, we have adopted the US Partnership on Mobility from Poverty's definition of mobility, which is this comprised of these three core principles of economic mobility being valued in community and power and autonomy. And this broader definition informs both our partnerships as well as the way that we approach outcomes. In our role as an intermediary, we provide technical assistance to housing providers and partners in adjacent sectors to support the development of shared outcomes. Our primary cross-sector partner has been Strive Together, the education intermediary focused on cradle to career outcomes. And our collaboration has involved exploring ways in which housing can be a better platform or pathway for economic mobility through cradle to career education partnerships. And we know that housing and education can be important foundations for future success that underpin many aspects of mobility. But as with many cross-sector initiatives, the housing and education systems were not designed to work together. Next slide. So we really set out to figure out how we could overcome the challenges between these systems barriers by cultivating intentional partnerships that were built on the development of shared outcomes. We approach each of our engagements very systematically, beginning with an assessment and then moving through partnership development, developing locally relevant strategies, thinking about outcomes, and then moving on to the opportunities to inform policy and ultimately systems transformation. We're a ways from there. Next slide. However, in our work, we're constantly reminded of how housing as well as other systems perpetuate racial and economic disparities. And we're reminded of how physical and economic segregation, especially with Black Americans, has created high rates of residential and educational segregation. The vastness of the problem has led us to consider this as a discrimination iceberg problem, meaning that we're aware of the overt policies and programs that are leading to, or the disconnect between systems that are effectively preventing mobility or contributing to these racial disparities. But because of this vastness, we're really actually in our work trying to focus more intentionally on the questions below the waterline. So thinking about the ways that, like, how we are doing our work as the part that really deserves our greatest attention. Move to our next slide. As a result, we developed an anti-racist inventory approach to the way that we deliver our technical assistance. This inventory was developed collaboratively amongst the interdisciplinary team members that support economic mobility. And we started with a couple of anti-racist frameworks with a goal of being able to develop a shared approach that we could all lean into and buy into in doing our work. We landed on these 5 principles. And over the next few slides, I'll go into more detail about each of those principles, but the 5, as you're seeing on the slide here, overcoming disparate incomes, which we see as in entering engagements by assessing and acknowledging any disparate impacts, designing engagements to intentionally and explicitly undo racially based harm. Second, humility in relationships, continually adapting methods of partnership, evaluation, and reflection to be effective partners with communities rather than for communities. And all relationships being durable and accounting for transition that mitigate harm should be patient and humble. The third being courageous reflection for changing unconscious white supremacy. So creating and maintaining safe spaces for ongoing internal reflection of our impacts and creating radically honest feedback loops from our partners. Fourth being power shifting. So identifying power in our relationships and explicitly moving to share our power. And last, advocacy and allyship. So using that power to challenge assumptions and build bridging spaces. So in the next couple of slides, we'll go over them in a little bit more detail. We can move on to the next slide. So the questions that we ask of ourselves as technical assistance providers working with partners in the either housing sector or adjacent sectors, or they're questions that we ask ourselves if we are in fact participating in any of the partnerships. And for the purposes of today, I wanted to share some of those questions at 3 of those different, there's 6 different levels that I identified to our approach, but 3 in particular just to focus on for today. How we're engaging in partnerships and collaboration, those locally relevant strategies, and the measurable outcomes. So again, at the disparate outcomes level, entering engagements by assessing and acknowledging any disparate impacts and designing our engagements to intentionally and explicitly undo racially based harm. We're asking questions that are very specifically tied to disparate outcomes, both of ourselves and the partnerships. We're ensuring that the strategies are tailored to close any disparity gaps, and asking specifically whether or not the strategies are repairing historic harm. And then when we look at outcomes, you'll note that the outcomes are very much tied to these questions of power, autonomy, and being valued in the community. So we're asking very specifically what comes out of these partnerships, whether or not they're tying back to those three elements. You can move to the next slide. For our second principle, humility in relationships, as we are spending time adapting our partnerships to continue to be good partners with, as opposed to for communities. So whether or not we are ourselves white, Black, Latinx, Indigenous, or Asian, we're all working within organizations that represent power and have benefited from this power differential. So we're thinking about this from an organizational lens, and how, as an organization, we are coming to the communities that we're working in and ensuring that we're asking questions intentionally, and ensuring that the questions that are raised are ones that are generated from the perspective of the community members. And we want to make sure that that's true, and that those voices are elevated, and that those needs are elevated in how we collaborate. And then again, to ensure that they are central in the questions for the strategies, and then mostly in the outcomes, ensuring that our outcomes are then driven by the community voices and are the evaluation of those. Next slide. Very similarly, with our courageous reflection for changing unconscious white supremacy, I think the most important thing in this category is just recognizing that we acknowledge that everything we do either combats or supports a white supremacist culture, and that our organizations are built within a space to promote a white supremacist culture. And so we want to be very intentional to ask whether or not we are gatekeepers of knowledge, and whether or not we are asking for feedback from folks who we may or may not have felt comfortable asking for feedback from. With respect to the strategies, making sure that we're not creating or reinforcing notions of deservedness or limiting access to knowledge or legitimacy. And then again, with those questions of outcome, we are making sure that we're continuing to focus on not promoting a white supremacist notion, and to ensure that we are engaging with the community in reflecting on our process and measuring whatever outcomes we're working with. Next slide. So once we have spent time thinking about our power, then the next step, of course, is to engage in shifting some of that power. And that requires us acknowledging upfront where our power lies, how our power is being used, and what we can do about shifting that power, recognizing it in all of our relationships at that table, and then thinking about how we can, through our strategies, be very considerate of that, to acknowledge the racialized power dynamics and our positionality, and then foster trust building and collaboration wherever possible. Also recognizing that it is a function of power that allows us to think beyond the bounds. And so trying to create space for that to spur radical imagination. And in our outcomes, then we look to see whether or not we have managed to equalize power or eliminate barriers for distribution of power and resources. Next slide. In this last category of advocacy and allyship, it's once we have moved through that evaluation of our power and begun to share it, that we're in a better position to serve as allies and to advocate. In this case, the goal is to advocate not for a community, but with a community, and to do so with, to support their solutions. We think about that through the frame of how long we are in partnership with communities and what the support looks like, both in terms of the partnership as well as in terms of the strategies and any harm that might be caused as a result of a strategy being time limited. And so again, last, as we're measuring outcomes, then the outcomes here really focus on whether or not it is the goals and the needs of the community that we are advocating for and promoting as being our markers of whether or not we are being successful. So if we can go to our second to last slide. This slide is just really just the graphical representation for those who like pictures more than words, just to show that we're really seeing this as functioning in terms of movement, that we are processing through our own evaluation, going through this inventory at each level so that we can be in a position to move from power awareness, power shifting into a position that that healing can happen at a community level, and healing can happen between community and institutions. And finally, ultimately, that we can disrupt the systems that are causing harm. So in our last slide was just, I wanted to thank you. And I'm going to transition us over to Chuck, who I think has a very different framework that he's going to share with us now. But thank you, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Anne. Can everybody hear me okay? Yes, great. I just want to say, Anne, that was fantastic. I love how explicit you all are in the work that you do. And as an organization of Project Evident, I think there are lots that we can learn from what you've done. Okay, so now let me see if I can find my slides. All right, can everybody see that?
Yep.
Great, thank you. So when I am having conversations about equity, diversity, inclusion, I always like to start with how I come to the work, because I have a certain perspective in how I think and how I come to it, which influences how I show up. And I like being transparent about that. And the thing I'll say two things about this list. One is that when Anne talked about power, it is one for me that is really present that I think about. So in the third bullet where I said reflective of my strengths and blind spots, what that boils down to me is that as a Black man who grew up poor in the South, I am highly aware of when I am feeling powerless, and will do lots of things to move from that spot. My blind spots are trying to remind myself of where I have power. Power in terms of my gender, power in terms of my education and the roles that I'm in, and that I need to be just as conscious of that as in the places that I am feel powerless. And then this piece around a practitioner mindset for me is about I've spent most of my career in the nonprofit space, doing the work directly, and so I'm always asking a question: how do you make this concrete, and how do you put it into action in a way that is going to maintain momentum, and not get distracted by all the other things that organizations are trying to do at one time? Skip the slide, sorry. Organization I work with is Project Evident. We are only 4 years old. We work with organizations across the country to help them use the power of evidence to improve the impact that they're having for the populations they care about. So we don't do the work directly. We are doing it through the organization who's working with a particular set of participants who are receiving services, or in the instance of a foundation who are working with organizations who are working with participants. But in all those situations, we are helping them drive their own learning agenda. And so there's 3 primary principles we have in doing the work. Number 1 is that we want to have the practitioners in the driver's seat of their own learning and evidence agenda. What we have found is that folks in the nonprofit space come to this feeling compelled to do the work because it is driven by a funder, whether that's a private or public funder. And so the evidence isn't used as directly for their own learning as it is to share to the funder because of what they got paid for. So helping them be in a place where they are in that driver's seat. We also believe that data and evidence is a continuous process that should be at the core of organizations, not something that is off to the side that you do every now and then because somebody asked. And that the voices of the community and the participants that you work with should be at the center of your work. And they are helping you answer the question, what are you doing? Why are you doing it? And is it having the impact that you intend? Here are our values. I'm sorry, I cannot tell which parts of this you can see. Hopefully you can see all of it. We know that data and evidence has a history of being weaponized for marginalized communities, particularly those of color. But we believe that with these principles, we can use it to address social and racial justice, and think about how to make it actionable for folks. And when we partner with organizations, our goal is to end up being a trusted partner, where we are being, as you described, and working with them, not for them, being aware of the power that we may walk into the room with, and talking about the desire to be clear that we have a certain level of expertise, but we're not here to say this is what you have to do. We talk about how we help think about together the direction they want to go in. What's that path look like? And do that from a place of understanding that context matters and that their expertise is critical to doing the work. So this slide, I just want to say, I use the word evidence a lot, and people are like, well, what do you mean by evidence? We define it as data plus analysis to inform decision making. So you get all types of information from lots of different sources. Some of it's numbers, some of it's stories, but you take that and analyze it and think about what does this mean for what we're trying to accomplish and where we're trying to go next. And if you're doing that on an ongoing, regular basis, intentionally, that is what we define as evidence. So what does that mean from an equity standpoint? How do you think about equity in the context of building and using evidence? We think about this as both an outcome and a process. So when we're thinking about the process where equity comes in, it's who's involved with collecting the data, who owns the work, what methods are folks using, are they culturally responsive, how are folks intentionally choosing the tools and how they're used. And a critical one is whose knowledge base is being centered, whose perspectives and whose goals. If you're just relying on someone from the outside to bring their expertise, you're centering them, not the population that you're working with. And we want you to really encourage looking at broader aspects of the work as you think about how do I get really intentional about this. And when we talk about outcomes, we're talking about outcomes for the participants and being specific about what works and what doesn't work. Who does it work for and under what conditions and contexts? It is not good enough just to say on average, our outcomes are good or they're better than they were. It is really important to understand who in that population that seems to be working for, because it is likely not working for some. And for the energy and effort to be spent around how do you keep doing the things that's working for one sort of group, but how do you think about and change and test new ideas when you're thinking about the participant outcomes. So Project Evident developed a tool or framework we call a Data and Evidence Equity Guide. And the circle represents the 5 pillars, if you will, of what are the foundations to generating evidence and using evidence. We think it's important to have a strong culture of learning, that you have a theory of change where you're being intentional about what you're collecting and why, because you believe that is going to have the change that you expect, that you have data systems for keeping track of the data and analyzing it. You have data collection that you're using, and then you're using and reporting that data out. And when we think about that from the equity standpoint, it means that when you talk about a culture of learning, it's about an action orientation as well as inclusion of all staff, all participants, and community stakeholders. Oftentimes, again, as you think about evidence being a compliance-driven activity for a number of organizations, it means that you often don't include the folks who are most impacted. You're usually including the leadership who's then handing it off to someone else. And that, again, it does not lead to more equitable outcomes. When you talk about a theory of change, this is the building block that says, if I do this thing over here, it's going to lead to these outputs and then these short-term, medium, and long-term outcomes. That again can't just be driven by the organization without looking at uh, systematic barriers and challenges that cause the problem, and how are your solutions helping to address that, which means you have to not just factor in the staff in the organization, but also the participants and the broader community that you're working with to say, does this seem right? Or even before that, um, help us test our analysis about how this is going. The data systems, you want to make sure you're protecting privacy, not just taking people information because you can, and needing to get their consent. Data collection is about making sure you are representing or working with the folks who you say you are designed to work with. Sometimes organizations will say, our mission is to work with X population, and when they collect the data, they find out that very little of the X population is responding and more of the Y. And it is critical to look at that and understand what are some of the barriers, and where are the differential impacts happening across the groups. And then the final piece around data use is understanding the impact, the differential impact. Is what I said I'm doing positively affecting the population that it is designed to do that with? And if it is, great, how do you keep doing more of that? And if it's not, how do you adjust your program to make it more equitable and reach the segment of the population that's not benefiting from the services that you're providing? We are really early stage in this for Project Evidence. We have used this framework over the last year. I decided not to show the actual tool because right now it is literally a spreadsheet and it gets overwhelming looking at just a spreadsheet. But what I'll tell you, in each one of these categories, what we identify are key practices that organizations will take and reflect on how they're doing it. And they have to do that as a team. It is not something that can be done by an individual, because that individual has their own way of thinking about it, doing it, and you need to test the reality of that. So we look for teams that are diverse in terms of position, in terms of race and gender, in terms of perspective and responsibilities. And the idea is that as you talk through this, one of the things you're going to do is get explicit about what that practice actually looks like. And you may be surprised that what you think may not be the same as what your teammate thinks, even though you're all talking about the same program. And understanding where the pain points are of where pieces are not meeting together. So just as a quick example, we had an organization that we work with where they did this reflection and they did it individually. Actually, I'm going to just go ahead and stop sharing. They used the tool individually and then came back together to compare their scoring. And the scoring goes from 0, meaning we're nascent in this practice, up to a 4, which means we are mastering this practice. And they noticed that there was difference in scoring by where you sat in the organization. And as they talked about it, what they realized is that they were good at talking about what a great job they do with data and evidence. But when you started digging underneath, they realized it's not as strong as we thought. And they made the leap, and this is the part that was important, to say that if we think this, given the positions that we're in, what are the junior staff thinking about the data that we're asking them to collect and analyze? Where are they able to find the voice to say, this doesn't make sense to me, or I don't agree with this, if we aren't aligned with how we're thinking, how this shows up. So this data and equity guide gives folks a place to start having conversations that don't typically happen because they're in, often I think, because they're in the throes of, we've got to do this work, we've got to do this work, we've got to do this work. And we don't have time to stop and reflect, or they don't make time to stop and reflect about how to do that more intentionally, and particularly as you think about where equity shows up. So with that, I'm going to stop there and hand it back to Emily.
Thank you so much, Chuck, and thank you, Anne. And we've had a couple questions come in, and then I have a couple of my own, and I invite anyone else to jump in as well, either either verbally or in the chat. So Anne, first we had a question for you, which was, how does Enterprise approach criminal background checks for the properties they develop to address disparate incomes for people with justice system involvement?
Yeah, I love that question. So that's an evolving practice, I think is how I'll frame that. The work that we've been doing in economic mobility is a relatively new practice at Enterprise. And so like Chuck was discussing, it's very much evolving and new work for us. And in the way that we have been started this work in looking at adjacent sectors related to education, we're now beginning a deeper exploration in other adjacent sectors, and most significantly, focusing our attention on returning citizens and that intersection in that space. And so at this point, I think where we are is in that process of evaluating what our assumptions are and starting to make those shifts. As a person who is not sitting in ECD, our Enterprise Community Development part of Enterprise, I can't speak specifically about those decisions, but I know that that is an area where we are organizationally bringing time and attention and specifically addressing that question. So I actually would say stay tuned, and I see that as being one of those particularly impactful areas of evolving practice that we're engaged in and beginning to apply this particular lens. So thank you for raising that question.
Thanks, Anne. And so another question for you is, so some of the outcomes that you mentioned in the 5 principles could be considered somewhat subjective, where people could draw different conclusions in their evaluation. So how do you manage the subjectivity factor there? Great.
So I think a great deal of that, again, this is all of our evolvingness in this practice and trying it on and doing the new things, but it is an intentional effort to have the community that we're working with be involved in leading the answers to some of those questions. So they are absolutely subjective, and ones where I think the importance for us is that we're not necessarily in the driver's seat, nor are the organizational partners so much in the driver's seat of making the decisions about what that right outcome might be. And I think that's where the shift has been for us, is beginning to think about whether or not the decision about whether or not an outcome is considered a good outcome or a valuable outcome is one that we would necessarily have led with, but maybe is one that through a different lens is more impactful than what we would have previously considered. So it's more that shift of who's making the evaluation that we're testing through this model.
Got it. Thanks. That makes a lot of sense. So a question for Chuck. So in your model, I was sort of thinking about some of the ways I've seen some of these concepts incorporated into research. And so certainly one that I've heard talked about a lot recently relates to things like making sure you have a qualitative component of a project where you hear from residents, making sure that you really incorporate the lived experience of residents into projects. What are some other, and maybe those aren't great examples, and I'd love it if you could offer some others, but what are some examples that you've seen that you could offer where organizations are really thoughtful about this?
So I would say those actually are good examples because what, again, typically happens is that, I shouldn't say typically, in my experience and my experience with Project Evident, is that organizations focus on first trying to find a service that is in response to a need that a community has. Often there will be an opportunity in the beginning to say, is there a demand for this? And then you just run with it. And the question is, do you go back and then test over time? Is that still the right service? Is it still the right need? And is what we're doing having the impact that we want to have? And to answer that, you've got to go beyond just the staff who's collecting that data. You've got to bring those other voices in from the program participants and from your community partners to assess how that's going. And we've worked with organizations that not only collect feedback from participants, but they actually engage them in what they find, and they engage them in the conversation of, help me interpret what this means. And that's another level that folks are trying to get to, but that we want to encourage. It's great to collect that information as a starting point, but you want to get to a place where they're in that conversation with you about the design that you're having of your program that's meeting the need that they're saying is important to them, not what you think is important for them.
Thanks. And I was also thinking about, so sometimes I've seen, and I'm sure others have seen, like panels at conferences where there are resident panels. And I think sometimes it's hard to do something like that well, because it can kind of feel a little like you're tokenizing these people or asking a current resident, there's like a power differential there. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on trying to do those kinds of things in a thoughtful way.
I would say don't start there. That you have to be intentional about inclusive throughout the process. So when I talked about equity being a process and outcome, it is the intentionality of going right from the beginning through. So I'll give an example of a place that I used to work where we started from day one talking to potential participants about a program to say, hey, what do you think about this? And do you think that we have the outcomes right? Is there anything else you would include? And by the way, once we get this started, we're going to come back and ask you to help us continue to think about this. So when we got to a point where it was running, it was going, and then we said, to that group, would you help us think about how to bring this to legislators, and bring your voice to this around how the impact of this program and the implications for policies and laws can drive this even further? And then we got to a place where we were doing conferences, and we did want to have panels where they were participating. And those could be either panels where it is our program participants with other program participants talking about the experience, or a mix of program participants and staff talking about the experience. But the idea is that we valued their work, their contribution from the beginning, and kept testing that along the way, not just, hey, we've got a conference coming up, will you come sit on the panel? To me, that feels disrespectful. It feels tokenized in the sense that, you're doing this because it may make the organization look good, but what is it benefiting the person who's participating? And that kind of stuff I want to stay away from.
I have another example very similar of watching an evolution of engagement where the first initial thought was adding a few of the program participants as part of a task force, and ultimately recognizing that it would be beneficial and maybe more appropriate to shift the design of the task force so that it was a majority of the task force being participants, and then professionals in a minority position, and that it was then working with the participants on an ongoing basis to develop a framework that was resonant with the participants, and allow the participants then to work both jointly with the professional staff and in the kind of going back as a bridging capacity with other participants, such that they were very central to the design of the programs, to the framework, to thinking about what the appropriate outcomes would be, as well as what the pinch points might be at a policy level, and how those show up as participants and how they experience them, so that as the professional staff participating in the task force, we're in a better position to be able to advocate for and appreciate what the challenges might be in their role. But again, seeing that as an evolving process, where the initial thought was more, let's involve someone at a panel level, or just participating in a much more token way, to recognizing how fundamentally different the experience would be if we made this shift to changing the number of folks and how we're centering the participants and their role in the space.
And like, can I just double click, highlight what Anne said? One is that I think that often the rub that happens is when we as practitioners come in with a plan and are asking people to join that plan, and realize, ask them to join a plan and then ask them to have a voice. And when they say they don't like that plan, that's where the rub happens, right? And so being able to have that flexibility is really important. And I want to say, it is hard to do. It is hard to do because of how we're trained. It is hard to do because of how the money flows. It's hard to do if you don't have or don't feel like you have that power to shift the thinking. And it's part of a lot where I like Anne's framework, because it puts all of that right on the table right from the beginning about asking questions that hopefully raise some of those things that are assumptions that folks come into conversations with. You put those assumptions on the table and then figure out where to move from there.
Thanks to you both. That was really helpful. And so we had a question come in that says, what would Anne say to someone who suggests that it's sufficient not to be racist rather than embracing inclusivity? And the second part of that question is, does Chuck have data to support a difference in the outcomes based on those two attitudes?
Can you repeat my question again?
Sure. What would Anne say to someone who suggests that it's sufficient to not be racist rather than embracing inclusivity?
I think I'm not really sure how those things can happen separately. What we have experienced historically is that the separation, which is, I think, the opposite of inclusivity or not having a seat at the table, translates into the disparate outcomes. And if we're not, it seems to me that as long as we are continuing to promote an option of not being inclusive, that because of the way that our the systems around us operate and have operated in a way that is driving disparate outcomes, that by virtue of essentially standing on the sidelines, we're not in a position to affect change. We're not in a position to undo the fundamentally racist framework that is driving outcomes. So I think we end up in a tight spot if we're not embracing the component of inclusivity, and inclusivity that is actually tied to equity, to be able to assert that one is not racist. Like, it is unclear to me how you can have those two things operating simultaneously. And I would actually love to hear Chuck's perspective on that as well.
I'm in the same spot as you are. I don't know how, I guess maybe it depends on how you define being anti-racist. But in my definition, inclusion is part of that definition. Particularly as I reflect back on the role of power and privilege, that in racist structures, there are folks who have power and influence to do certain things, and folks who don't. And so if you are, again, by my definition, if you are anti-racist, that means you are actively dismantling that power structure so that folks are more inclusive in having influence and power about what is happening to them. And Emily, would you mind repeating my question too? I'm sorry.
Oh, sure. The second part was, does Chuck have data to support a difference in the outcomes of these two attitudes?
A difference in the, and are the two attitudes mine or some other attitudes?
I think they're referring to the attitudes of trying to be anti-racist versus embracing inclusivity.
Hmm. I don't know if I say I have data on that. I can point to experiences with it, and things that we've written and read, but oh, someone wrote another question. Is the question really anti-racist versus non-racist? I don't know. But yeah, I don't, I would want to know more to be able to ask, to get to be able to point to any data on that.
Well, I can see if they follow up with any other questions, but
Okay.
I had another one for you both, which is, this is, I think some of the work that you both have discussed is can feel like a heavy lift for organizations. And so sometimes when they think about starting this work, I'm thinking about organizations I've worked at in the past, you form a committee, right? And then you look to the people of color on that committee to try to guide that work. So I guess the question is, what advice do you have for organizations to get started on this work and to do it in in the right way, however you might want to define that?
And do you want to start or you want me to? Nope. So I would say, actually, I'm going to start with where I'm coming from, which is that I believe there is great fear of doing it wrong. And when that happens, people freeze up and don't want to do anything. And so a place for me to start is to try. And I would try, you're gonna have to do this on your level of risk, how much risk you can take. So I often talk about this in terms of maybe trying with some friends first before you bring it to work because you trust and have that relationship. That it's important to have supports when you're trying to have this conversation, to be able to go back and say, I don't know if that quite worked. Any other ways to suggest it? But just trying something. I think if you are a leader in the organization, to try and think about how it connects to your overall mission, to some of your strategies, and finding ways to build in conversations where if we can just start with trying to name the thing that we think is important around diversity, equity, inclusion in our work. We have a mission statement. Do we have a mission statement about why diversity, equity, inclusion is important? And that process in itself starts to give an organization language, common language, which is the key thing. When I say diversity, I mean this versus that. When I say equity, this is what I mean. For example, at Project Evident, when we talk about, or early on when we were talking about diversity, we prioritized Black and Brown as the place that we would start. And we added gender to that as well. Because a definition like diversity can get into all kinds of places. But start there and try to start in a place of, we know this is a starting place. We know we're not going to get it right, but we are committed as a group to getting in the habit of bringing this up, talking about it, testing it, meaning, we have a framework for, that sounds too big. We have a mission for what it means for us, and we're going to test what that looks like in practice for a certain amount of time, and come back and look at that on a regular basis. That would be a place I would start, and feel free to get help. There's lots of people out there who are looking to help organizations figure out how to have these conversations in ways that feel more comfortable than others.
I love that, Chuck. I will highlight and underscore all of the things that Chuck said. And it's also a question that we've been grappling with some others. And I think the only thing that I would add is it is definitely just hard to get started. So, and also because of that, I think one way is to lead with the goal of seeing race, because we have so often, I think, found comfort in a notion of being colorblind, and that the goal then is to move from being colorblind to being color brave. And so to set the framework of one where we're acknowledging that every conversation is probably hard and uncomfortable and runs against what any of us want to do in a professional setting, is to have these particularly vulnerable conversations, but to set the expectation that we will look for and see where race is a factor, where we'll look at any disparities, that will acknowledge and just make a practice of recognizing where race is a factor and how race is a factor, as a way of being able to begin to overcome, I think, what is that protective notion of moving away from conversations about race. So in addition to all the things that Chuck suggests, I think just even leaning into the notion that we're going to look for it, we're going to see it, we're going to acknowledge race in all the places where race is, and then start to see how and where race really shows up for us in our work. So we can start disaggregating information so that we can begin to have the language and the comfort as a group to hold race as a factor in our conversations, but just by practice and setting the expectation that we're going to see race, we're going to acknowledge it, and we're going to be uncomfortable together.
Thanks to you both for that. And I see a couple other questions that have come into the chat. I see one says, in changing the language, what is the difference between equity and equality?
For me, equality means everybody gets the same thing, regardless of their starting place. Equity means acknowledging the playing field is not equal, shifting that playing field in a way that is equitable depending on where you are starting and where you're trying to go.
And I think the only other addition I would make is just ensuring that the solutions match what the needs are, so that everything is targeted, so that eventually everyone ends up in the same place or having the same opportunity.
Right, I've seen some nice graphics to that effect in the past. A question, what is the data relating to racism and colorism? How do the two influence diversity, equity, inclusion, and access?
And you keep putting me out here.
I mean, yeah, I mean, I definitely don't have anything on that. So I'm hoping that that either you might or know where someone might go to look for something for data around colorism.
Yeah, so this is going beyond my skill set here, but that has not stopped me from talking about it. So I will do that anyway. So, racism for me is is a systematic way of a certain group having advantages and another group not. Within that, colorism is feels like another level down, right? So there are privileges and advantages that connect to, for, I'm going to say, Black and brown people, the color of your skin, meaning the lighter you are, you have potentially more advantages than the darker you are. So on top of the racism that's going on, there are additional advantages and disadvantages that are associated with the color of your skin. That is how I understand it.
Thanks. And so, Anne, are you good? If so, I'll ask. What I think we have time for one more question that I'd love to pose to both of you, which is, with the administration change, what opportunities do you see to advocate for racial equity policy changes, like some of the ones that you've discussed?
Well, I'll start. I see Chuck will give me the floor. I think mostly I just see that it's a topic that is a viable one at the moment. And I think many of us are encouraged that that Biden opened with a memorandum instructing the departments to look at racism in the departments, the fact that that has led to his acknowledgement, and that it has led to a movement towards the reinstatement of AFFH. Affirmatively furthering fair housing. So I think that those are the kinds of indicators that suggest that there is an openness to the acknowledgement and therefore the opportunity to present the exploration of these topics. I also know that questions about reparations are coming back to into discussion. I know that I'm forgetting the name of it right now, but the large policy proposal that has been generated by so many folks to explore the multitude of ways that we can see equity in housing is floating around, and that there's now discourse around how the administration, how agencies can move from simply implementing on our existing policies, but moving into a new frame, whether it's universal vouchers or whether we're looking at kind of like the kind of the range of new things that are being explored, that there's now a conversation about just opening up of possibility that is a first in certainly my lifetime in seeing that kind of exploration. So I do think that there's possibility in a way that we haven't seen previously, that I see that there are that there's a building momentum across the variety of different sectors to work together and figure out how these changes could be possible in ways that are more meaningful as being cross-sector.
Fully agree and align with what Ann said. The only thing I would add is that my hope is that it makes the expression or the realization for some people that racism exists, that happened during the pandemic, it makes it last longer than a news cycle. That we don't, once we're able to get back together again and people feel like it's the new normal, that they don't forget that the pain experienced by Black and brown people throughout our lifetimes still is here, still needs to be addressed, and needs to be addressed at all levels. So that is what I'm hopeful for and encouraged by with what's happened so far with the administration.
Definitely. Well, I just want to thank Chuck and Ann so much for taking the time to do this. We really appreciate it. And I think it was a great conversation and I definitely learned a lot. So thank you. So let's see. So it's 4, so we'll stop here, but thanks everyone for joining us as well. And I hope this was helpful and we'll see you all soon.
Thanks everybody. Thank you, Ann.
Thank you, Chuck. Thanks, Emily.
Bye, Emily. Bye-bye.
Bye.